Okay, cool. So, today we're going to talk about the paper Why Neurons Mix, about higher dimensionality for high cognition. So it's going to be presented by me and Zach. Zach is at the retreat, so it'll just be me today. Sorry. So, So anyway, so a bit of context. So if you recall last week, if you were here, we talked about Towards a Neural Doctrine 2019. That paper actually references this paper inside of it, so we're kind of just diving in. So if we're just to remind ourselves, to set ourselves where this paper is. Towards a Neural Doctrine had 4 sections: correlated variability, decoding. This is for the most part where this paper is going to lie, in that decoding section. But it also had neural dynamics and artificial neural networks, which were arguing for this idea of using neural ensembles rather than individual neurons as the fundamental unit of neuronal computation. So in the decoding section for Towards a Neural Doctrine, it says, the title of the section that references this paper is Decoding Accuracy is More Than the Sum of Its Parts. So that's what we're going to think about a lot. So this paper.
This is a paper's name, right? It was a neural doctrine. It's a paper name.
Yeah, that was the title of last week's paper. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Feel free to stop me. It should be pretty short. So this week's paper is Why Neurons Mix Higher Dimensionality for High Cognition. So it talks about the big topic it has is mixed selectivity, which is that neurons are selective for nonlinear combinations of variables, and the terminology that you use when you're dealing with these is both, this paper argues, is both these mixed selectivity neurons give you high dimensional representations, and they're a signature for high dimensional representations. Once you have a high dimensional representation, you have the kernel trick for easy readouts. And the term that you often hear around mixed selectivity is that neurons are context sensitive. That's kind of a strange thing because it makes you, so I just like to point out right before we get started. So context sensitive actually can happen without like a switching variable. So if you look at log of x, in some sense a log function is context sensitive because if you're looking at the value of from 0 to 1, the function changes a lot. So it's fairly sensitive to data. And from like 90 to 100, it's not very sensitive to changes. So the log is changing very little bit. So that's the sense it's saying that these neurons are very context sensitive when you hear about that in mixed selectivity. And the fact that that happens with a log function or it can happen with a whole suite of functions is why you have to have nonlinear combinations for you to get this context sensitive. But it doesn't have to be a complicated nonlinearity. It just has to be some kind of nonlinear combination. Okay. So for today, I'm going to give you, I'm going to go through the paper basically in the order that the paper does things for simplicity. We're going to start off with an introduction to this paper, how this paper kind of presents itself. The role of mixed selectivity and how it gives us the higher dimensionality. This paper references an older paper which uses a kind of a unique measure for dimensionality that I didn't hear before. It also references principal component analysis, but they use this very literal counting of colorings technique that I'm going to really dive into because it's very much not something that I think you hear about in other papers. So I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on that for this. Then we're just going to very briefly kind of go over dimensionality transformations, that section. And there's a mountain of experimental evidence to suggest that we have mixed selectivity neurons. So this paper is coming from the aspect we do have these neurons. How do we have them? And a sneak preview for some of the evidence is at the end of the introduction, not the end of the talk. So introduction. Okay, so there are 2 views of neurons that have been popular, or 2 main views of neurons that have been popular. So the traditional view of neurons is that they're kind of like gears in a clock. They're very specialized. You have a single neuron maybe tells me if I'm looking at a table. So I have a table neuron, and I have another neuron that maybe tells me if I'm looking at a clock or what time it is. So you have this traditional Neurons, and in that sense, they're the same in every context. Either there is a clock or there's not a clock. If the neuron just tells me if I'm looking at a clock, or if it's a temperature neuron, perhaps it always tells me a linear version of the temperature. So maybe no activity if it's absolute 0, and 100% activity if I'm going to melt or something. So it's in that sense it's the same in all contexts. The difference of how sensitive it is the same. These are very simple to understand neurons, which is why they're the traditional view when you're thinking about the brain. That's a really complicated thing, so you have to make some simplifications, and this is the most simple you could get. So if you want to understand how you do some task, like how do we identify clocks, all we got to do is go find the clock neuron. Then there's the mixed selectivity view. A little bit more complicated. It says that neurons can do more than one thing, right? So one neuron might be doing many different tasks and to varying degrees of success. The responses are in this highly context-sensitive sense. So they might be sensitive sometimes, totally not sensitive other times. And they're complicated to understand because if you look at a single neuron and you try to measure it, so maybe you have this context-sensitive neuron, you show it in bars that are moving across the screen, it responds, now you think you have a bar neuron, you show it something else, and now it's responding to that too. So these neurons are much more complicated to understand because they respond to so many features. And because they respond to so many features, the only way to understand what feature the neuron is responding to is to look at multiple neurons so that you can get a context about which feature it actually is looking at right as it responds there.
Here, you mean feature, do you mean different conditions like that, or what do you mean feature here?
So I mean it in the broadest sense. So if you were looking at the visual system, you could think of it as actual like convolutions or something. But for this paper, it's talking about in the sense of if you're performing a task, there are some variables that are important to the task. Like if you're doing an image discrimination of 4 different images, you might respond to one of the 4 different images. That would be like the feature you're responding to. But if you respond to like 2 of the 4 images, then you're responding to multiple features of the task. If your only life purpose as a neuron is to handle discriminating 4 different images.
Just like if you have a picture, one neuron will respond to several pixels, something like that.
So you could still be a traditional neuron and respond. Well, actually no. So yeah, in the most traditional way, yeah, exactly. So in the most traditional way, you're looking at bars that are in this particular region of the visual space. So then you would be responding really to one pixel. But yeah, like you said, if you're responding to pixels in multiple different spots, you get your mixed selectivity. So why would the brain do the second? And to give you a bit of the evidence about it, so they did a monkey was performing some kind of cognitive task. It's not too important. They find that the monkey engages 40% of the cortical area just to do this kind of arbitrary cognitive task. So the argument they make, if you use 40% of your brain for a single task, or at least the cortical area, then either you can only do 2 tasks, or you're reusing some parts for other things. So if you could only use every neuron for one thing, and it took 40% of it to do one task, then you would be a very simple monkey. So also, and just in general, there's tons of evidence that you have these adaptive cortical neurons. Their responses change over the time, and they're very highly diverse in general. So that's the argument they give, that we're doing this mixed selectivity. So then they ask, okay, but why would we do that? That's really complicated. So to understand what the computational role of mixed selectivity is, we have to remind ourselves that mixed selectivity neurons are not random.
Another question.
Go.
So this is the same as the neural network, just one neuron there is a connection to all the features, with all the pixels, the image, the pixels. There is a link to there. The difference only is the weight. If you maybe it's only connected to 135 like that, the others maybe 0 and 135 have the weight not equal to 0. Is this the same thing for the mixed selectivity?
If the input is exactly those variables that are important for your task, then yes. So like if your task was an image and the only thing that mattered to you was the digits, like what digit was drawn, then it would be possible that you have many things, but each neuron would only be encoding the digit. That would still be in some sense a traditional neuron. Yeah. But what's important is that if a neuron only responds to one of the important things about the task, then it's like a traditional neuron.
Okay.
Yeah.
same as the logic of the neural network, the neural weight. There's a link to all the previous layer.
Right. So yeah, it's you could have the weights be non-zero if the inputs were not the variables that were important. Yeah, but yeah, exactly. It's that idea. And just like if you had those weights, you might respond to like different things, but if you gave it the same input, it would give you the same output. In that sense, it's not random. These neurons aren't random because if you give them there's some noise in the system, but if you give them the same input, they give you, depending on the experiment, I suppose, a fairly similar response. If you ignore things like learning and stuff, so you already have it learned. But your selectivity is highly context dependent, and that's the mixed selectivity, part of the aspect of mixed selectivity. So would this mixed selectivity improve our ability to read information out? The answer is yes. There's going to figure out. Okay. So if we have a task with 3 features, so F1 is feature 1, F2 is feature 2, F3 is feature 3, and we have neurons that exactly read those features. So neuron 1 is also exactly telling us feature 1, neuron 2 is exactly telling us feature 2, neuron 3 is exactly telling us feature 3, and it's perfectly linear, and they respond in this kind of manner. We can't distinguish, so if each of these dots corresponds to a different experimental condition, and we want to linearly separate the red dots from the yellow dots, then we can't do it because there's no line we can draw on this plane that will separate the red dots from the yellow dots. But if we combine them non-linearly, so perhaps the yellow doesn't increase as dramatically as the red when it's moving in this direction, which you can construct with just nonlinearities, then it becomes possible to construct lines that would distinguish these 4 points. And this perhaps wouldn't work for every possible way you could place these points, because you can't get around the fact that, you can't get around the fact that once you do it this way, if you could cleverly place your points such that it would break your particular nonlinear. But if there's only so many, there's only certain types of real conditions that you find yourself in. So if these are the 4 points that actually happen, then now you can separate them in no matter how you color these points. So if I choose these 2 as red, I can color them. I can still distinguish them from these 2. If I choose these 3, I can distinguish them.
And for the first one, mixed selectivity neurons are not random. You just mentioned there are noise.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is beyond what the intrinsic noise of the system is. So there is some randomness from intrinsic noise, or at least something that's not explained by mixed selectivity, because if you repeat the experiment, you get it. But they're not giving you completely random response, and you can still read some information out from them, right? So if it was a Gaussian, you can guess the peak, even though every individual one will be random.
So the mixed selective neurons here, for example, if you have a specific task, there are always some specific neurons to respond to that. Is this what you mean the mixed selectivity neurons?
That would be the traditional. So the left here is it would be like a traditional, and then the right is so left means that every neuron tells me just some linear understanding of the features, which is exactly equivalent to every neuron just telling me a linear thing for one single feature. And the right is where you combine the features non-linearly. So what I mean by that is if I look at these and each neuron actually just tells me what feature 1 is, feature 2 is, feature 3 is, I will get the exact same plane if I just mix them linearly. So if I linearly mix them, I'm still on the span, because the definition of the span is the linear combinations, which gives us a plane.
If you mean not random, do you mean the neurons not random, or the information it interprets is not random? What do you mean not random here?
The information it interprets is not random.
The neurons may change.
Yeah, they could change. If you look at them in an instant of time, and you ignore training and attention and stuff, they will give you a consistent response if you give them the same input. So they're not just noise machines.
So if I want to build a decoder for this, do I need explicit knowledge of that nonlinearity?
Sort of. So if I gave you these 4 points because I read them out of the neurons, you wouldn't need to know what the nonlinearity is because now you just have 4 points in a 3D space, and you can train a classifier on that and see if it works. Whereas if you wanted to turn this into that, then you're going to need to be more careful. Interestingly, an argument they make is if you just randomly mix stuff, you're golden, as long as you add some kind of nonlinearity. So that makes it a lot easier to do this. And we'll get into that a little bit. So here's the metric that they're going to use for dimensionality. They say that this one has useful dimensionality too, because I can only make like 2 cuts. Right? So I can make this cut and I can make this cut, but I can't make this cut. And this one has like 4 or 3. They're actually going to do a division that will make this look like 3. But the idea is that this one has more dimensions because I can split it in more ways. So their measure is going to be how many ways can I split something, divided by what are the total number of ways that it can be split. Or what are the total ways I can actually split something divided by the number of ways that it would be possible to split them if they were separable. And I'll say that again with more clarity. But basically, ultimately what they're saying is that if you do a nonlinear transformation, you can leave a span. A linear transformation of things that are in a particular subspace will never leave the subspace, but a nonlinear one could. And if once you've left that subspace, you could find more potential splits. Okay. All right. So yeah.
Just to mention, there is a linear artificial neural network. And we know the artificial neural network, the function, activation function is nonlinear. Why do we put a linear before that? Activation function usually is nonlinear.
So okay, yeah. So the way that we're going to check if we can do a split is to try to train it with linearly. And the argument is that at the very least, it's definitely possible for brains to do linear transformations with just there's like very simple biological mechanisms you can linearly transform. So just push current into a single neuron and add it up, and then integrate fire or something. So definitely if the network is if your brain is trying to read out data and you can do it linearly, it seems likely that the brain can read that data out. But if it can't do it linearly, then maybe it's not possible. So the argument for dimensionality itself, not an artificial network that's trying to copy the brain, but for measuring dimensionality, what's important is it possible to make these distinguishments just linearly in a single step? So like linear regression style. So the reason that this one is better than that one is because I can do it linearly, whereas this one I have to do nonlinearly. Okay. So I'm going to recall 3 quick measurements for dimensionality so that we can compare them. Well, I'm going to recall 2 and then contrast it with the one that I just mentioned. So when we're measuring dimensionality of a sequence of vectors, we can use the rank of the matrix. Very mathematically pure definition. Love it. Very easy to interpret rank of a matrix. The problem is if you use the rank of matrix, and there is actually noise, like there's randomness in our in our measurement, maybe our measurements are imperfect or the actual system is random, then we're almost certainly going to get a full rank matrix when we're done. If you just keep throwing vectors that are a little bit perturbed, the odds are, especially if we have way more vectors than we actually have characteristics of the problem, then we're almost certainly going to get a full rank matrix. So this isn't a great metric for actual experimental data. Principal component analysis, we've talked about several times in this talk, so I'm not going to go over the implementation, but what we'll say is that principal component analysis, the feature that this paper talks about why they don't like this or why they would contrast with this is a lower bound on dimensionality, because in principal component analysis, if you just drop the last vectors, you're basically saying that the noise of the noisiest vector is what you're going to assume for every matrix or every direction. And so in that way, it's a lower bound of dimensionality because the noise, you're not taking into account the shape of the noise that you have in the actual data. And another thing that it counts dimensions that are not useful for the task. And for those of you who are familiar with principal component analysis, raise your hand if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you say that again about that you're assuming the noise for your noise as a vector? When you say noise, do you mean variance, like when
variance.
You're reorganizing by variance? It's not necessarily. Do you mean neural noise, or do you mean variance of your data set?
Sorry, I mean neural. So I mean you're assuming that the neural noise is as high as the highest variance in your data set.
So you're always assuming that your first principal component is noise.
At least the ones that are dropped is an implicit assumption you're dropping them. So you're saying all these components are noise components. So in those directions, that's just going to be noise. So when you implicitly drop the lower whatever threshold you
I thought you
you're
were
saying
talking
that's
about. Okay, you're talking about. Okay.
Thank you. Another thing about principal component analysis that they argue is a bit of a problem is it also, besides being a lower measure, I don't have a good figure for this, so I plan on using some markers. Okay, so if you have data set that looks like this, they had a figure like this, but I didn't think it was very clear. So each of these is actually a line, not a point, right? This dimension does not do anything for your classability, but principal component analysis will still find it. So if this dimension, it does exist in the data, but it may as well not. It's a low, so we have a lower bound that also counts dimensions that are not useful for a task. So in that sense, it's not an ideal metric of dimensionality because you have a lower bound that's actually counting things that aren't even useful, which gives you kind of a noisy metric in some sense. So their metric is to exactly count the number of ways you can color the data that results in something that's linearly separable. And I have another slide on this, so if it's a little confusing still, this is actually quite possibly the most complicated metric I've ever seen for dimensionality in terms of implementation, but it sounds really nice at least. The nice thing about only doing colorings is if I have the 3 markers again, the number of colorings is going to be like, it's not going to matter the fact that I have a bunch of noise or a bunch of variance going in those orthogonal directions because I'm only counting colorings. So it only counts the dimensionality exactly that gives us the thing we want, which is ability to separate linearly. And because we're, when we train linear regression or we train linear networks, the same, which is the same thing, like in some sense, we can just cross-validate. We can, to check if we did a good separation, we can train it on 80% and then test it on 20%. And by testing it on the 20%, we're exactly taking into account the data set, the shape and the orientation of the noise. So we both don't count dimensions that aren't useful because they won't give us new separations, and we take into account exactly the orientation and shape of our noise by cross-validating our separation measures with our actual data. The downside is it's very expensive to compute, and it's the implementation is somewhat complicated. So I'm going to go into at least enough so that we can see what they mean by this. So here it is, this section. Counting linearly separable columns. So here's a picture to remind us, a different picture. We're going to say the coloring, what I mean by coloring is we take so when the neurons are not random, that means if I give it a specific experimental condition, I should get a similar result. So if I have a finite number of experimental conditions, I'm dealing with discrete variables, I will get discrete, like that many blobs, points. Okay, so if I average on each experimental condition, I will get 1 point per condition. You can think of it that way. I can then color each set of conditions a particular color. Either 1 or -1 is how they're going to talk about it in the paper, but here it's green and black. If I color this one green, this one black, this one green, I find I can't separate. If I color them all green or all black, I'll always be able to separate. And then here, if I color it green, green, black, I'll get separation, or black, black, green is the same. So notice that there's like, you can always color it the exact opposite. They always do binary classifications. On this one, you can color it in the same way, but I actually can, I can separate every possible color. So that's what we're going to count, but we're going to do it a little bit, and then we're going to use cross-validation. And we expect it to be low in the purely selected case from the argument before, or linearly mixed will not help us at all. Whereas we expect it to be high if we have some useful nonlinear mixing. Yeah, I'll have another slide. So this is more background. Okay, so there are 2 to the 3 possible colorings, but half of them are redundant. So I have 3 ones. I could trade this 1, 0, 0, and then it's binary, like that. So 0, 1, 1. So we have a truckload. If we have a lot of experimental conditions, there are a lot of ways we can color these. A lot, and that's kind of a challenge. And there are 24 experimental conditions. They stopped training classifiers after the first 100,000 and assumed they had gotten a representative sample. So that's the idea. There's a lot of colors, and that's only with 24 conditions. Kover's theorem. Does anyone want to explain Kover's theorem? I don't know it super well, but from what I read for this paper. The idea is that, yeah, I wasn't sure if it was a popular thing and I missed it. Okay, so here's what the only important thing that unless you want to get into the math for why they prove that this is going to be proportional with dimensionality, which was long. The important thing, Kover's theorem says that if we have more experimental conditions, it will become harder to train classifiers. It's pretty intuitive. If we have 2 points, very easy to train classifiers. If we have 3 points, it's going to be harder. If we have 80,000 points, it's going to be like nearly impossible to train any classifiers. And this is only because of the number of points that we have. And what Kover's theorem specifically says is that it's going to like fall off at some point, and where it falls off is going to correspond to the dimensionality of the thing. So if we have truly a 2-dimensional thing, we should expect the ability to train classifiers to fall off once we start taking 3 points. So that phase point is what they're going to say is proportional to the dimensionality of the thing. Just ignore the NCs and NCCs. Okay, so this is the method that they're going to use. So the first thing you have to realize when you're doing this linear separation thing is they actually have 2 important things for counting these colorings, which is how many conditions they select and the number of neurons they train on. So the number of conditions they set will tell us how many points it took for us before we started to fail to train classifiers. That number of points it took before we started to fail classifiers, this is in reference 6. Yeah. That is the thing that's proportional to dimensionality. The number of neurons will tell us if we actually managed to find it or if we didn't pick enough neurons. So the neurons will tell us if we have enough data to actually tell us what the dimensionality is. So we take some subset of conditions, and then they have like 3 methods for how they figure out. The idea is now once you remove a condition, you need to mix that condition in with the other data so that you don't like both conditions in with the other data. That way, that's no longer a condition because it's like mixed in with all your data. And you need to do this in a way that you can't use that condition to classify. It's actually really like the idea is very simple. Like you just want to average over the other condition, but apparently the method was very complicated. I'm not 100% sure why they couldn't just average, but they didn't. Not exactly, at least. So if you take a subset of conditions and then you just average over the other conditions is how I think about it. Now for each of these, so there's that average activity vector. We've taken C conditions. Now we're going to color 2 to the C possible times. For each of these, we're going to train a linear classifier, and we're only going to train that classifier on like some proportion of data, maybe 80%, I think is what they use. And then they're going to test it, they're going to validate it after that linear regression on the remaining data, and they just threshold. So if like 80% of it, if the classifier is 80% activate above the it's above some threshold on the remaining data, it's implementable. Then you sum the number of implementable classifiers. So you had NC implementable classifiers. You divide it by the total number of classifiers. So that will depend only on the C. So it's just 2 to the C. No, total number of classifiers is 2 to the C. And then we find the values of C such that the coloring falls off. And they do that with like a log space thing. All here's the plot. Now that we have enough data, this comes from, so in a purely selective neuron, so this is like, they, instead of using artificial data, they actually took their real data, found only the purely selected neurons, or things that were most like purely selected neurons. I don't know if that's really helpful for understanding this plot, but then they would say purely selected neurons have very low dimensionality because this number, I should say, light lines, not very many neurons, dark lines mean very many neurons. The dashed lines are like extrapolated, I think. No, it's the error bars. It's the error bars. So the idea is that by this we see that we're approaching an asymptote, so we really do know what the true dimensionality is. And the number that they see is actually, they're going to say the number dimensionality is like right there because it starts to fall off. So they're going to say it's like got like really low dimensionality, three-dimensionality. Whereas they look at it with the actual data, they do this process of this coloring process. They find that as they pick more and more neurons, it doesn't start to. I'm connected. It doesn't start to fall off until much later. So this has high dimensionality. And that is what you would do with this metric. So for dimensionality, you would do all this complicated coloring for each task, each specific task, and experimental condition, there we go. And for every experimental condition, the number of experimental conditions you select, you train a ton of classifiers, and then you fit it in log space and find where the sigmoid starts to fall off.
So what the color means here from light to dark, what this means in these two plots?
So in both plots, the lightest means when you do this operation when you only use a small number of neurons, and dark means you're using a lot of neurons. So the idea is it should approach a single value, and if it doesn't appear to be approaching it, which this one is kind of a little bit more of a stretch, but they do some. No, but yeah. So they're saying that if this is happening, we definitely have a good measure of dimensionality. So that's how you can tell how well you're doing. And then boom, there you go. Now you have a number. So this would be like, I think it's like 3 or something, and then this is like more. This is like 10.
And just to be triply clear, the dimensionality that we're talking about is the dimensionality of the firing rates.
Yeah.
Neurons?
Yeah.
So it's not surprising then that the purely selective neurons have less dimensionality because you took ones that had lower dimensional responses to start with?
Yes, that is exactly what they're
Say
going
that
to do.
again?
You took neurons that had really low dimensional responses to start with, and you put a bunch of them in a pool, and then you got a network that had lower dimensionality out.
It's more of an argument that the metric works than like a novel idea.
Okay.
They like this metric. A lot of their papers use this metric. I don't see it often, and I imagine it's because it's so complicated to implement. So I really wanted to focus in on what they were talking about here. But this is their proof that the metric is working as they say it does, or some part of their proof of this.
So the difference between these two plots is the A is purely selective neurons, so the B is mixed selective neurons. Oh, that's different.
Yeah.
What is T? I forget what T is.
That's the total number of classifiers. So if I take C more, like a more number of points, there are way more number of ways I can color it. So I want to divide by the number of ways that I can color it. So tell me how many of them are actually colorable.
So I don't know a ton about like clustering, but how is this different from asking like as you increase the number of clusters you're trying to find, how well does that data cluster add looks different? Like some like K-means clustering, like as we increase the number of clusters we try to find, how well does the data still cluster? Intuitively, is that kind of what's similar to what's happening here? Is that this is very different or?
I think it's the same idea. Well, yeah, I think it's not exactly because you're coloring each cluster. Can you say it again?
Well, just thinking about like trying to figure out how well like your data clusters. Like using like something that's not orthogonal like DCA, like even like ICA where you're trying to like cluster the data rather than, and then like just asking as I increase the number of clusters I'm looking at, how separable are my clusters? Is this kind of what?
Oh, it's not quite the same because the difference is they're going to say that the clusters are only helpful if they let you color it differently. So they don't care, even if you can find 2 different clusters, or 3 different clusters, if you can't separate this cluster, like if you can't merge these 2 clusters together, then the fact that you have 3 clusters isn't very helpful compared to if you had 3 clusters in 3 dimensions. I
Sorry,
think.
can you say that one more time? I think I said that.
Yeah, so here it is. So if I have 3 clusters that are in a plane, so that picture, actually, I'll go to the figure earlier. So if I have 3 clusters successfully, I'm still going to say that these clusters are not as helpful as these clusters. So I'm gonna penalize clusters that look like this compared to clusters that look like
Okay. I didn't realize those were clusters. I thought that was just like a high-dimensional plotting of the neural firing rates, like for one specific.
So these are averaged over a condition.
I realized they were.
Right, yeah. It's kind of confusing. Yeah, so if you imagine these as clusters, which they're going to argue that you will get clusters because I'm giving it the exact same experimental condition, then, yeah, that's it. Any other questions?
And in the last map, in the last slide, there is a find critical phase point. What do you mean here?
So what they mean is where it falls off. So they're saying the dimensionality, because of this function like neatly tells you a specific point where it starts to fall off. They're saying that dimensionality will, once you get the number of conditions equal or to the number of dimensions, as you add more conditions, you'll start to rapidly lose you'll start to get a lot fewer implementable classifiers, and this is based on some assumptions about the input.
Also, you mean the critical points is for the number of dimensions, like the count off like that.
Exactly. They're going to say, well, right here, everything's classifiable. So boom, I definitely have at least this many dimensions. And then over here, well, I'm not consistently classifying everything, so I don't have this many dimensions. Yeah. Okay, cool. So that was the most complicated part I wanted to get through. I think that's the most novel part about this paper was. My time. Okay. So now I'm just going to kind of quickly go through the other sections, see if anyone has any questions about the paper, if they want to make any notes. For dimensionality transformations, so now that we've seen kind of that we have these mixed selectivity neurons, they're useful because they can give us this higher dimensionality. And we saw a new metric for how we can measure that, but you would have seen it if you're doing PCA as well. What are some ways we can transform dimensionality? They give a couple examples. They say, well, you could do max pooling or pooling of some sort. That's a way you can reduce dimensionality. Whereas when you're doing processing, and what they mean by processing, like recurrent processes, that is like kind of, in some ways, randomly projecting it in the higher dimensions, or the same dimension. Those random projections will give you higher dimensionality, which is kind of a cool, it's a simple, fairly simple proof. It has some, but it's kind of a cool little thing. It kind of just like pops out that you get higher dimensionality that way, as long as you have a nonlinearity. Dimensionality reduction, so they make a specific suggestion. They say if these high dimensionality is something that you're using for readouts, then when you're right prior to trying to do some kind of readout, you should have really high dimensionality, and then you actually do the readout, and now you have low dimensionality. So if we're doing sensory processing, and the only thing we care about is it's a car, right before we're trying to determine if it's a car, we should have high dimensionality, but then once we do the actual once we're actually determining it, now we have low dimensionality. And once we're in the low dimensionality place, we have better generalization, because now we just have the neuron telling us exactly what we want to know. We want to know if it's a car, and we have a single neuron that tells us it's a car or not. So in that case, you would want this low dimensionality. Again, this is kind of a repeat of the previous slide, but it also mentions the deep neural networks. So invariance computation is just the idea that if I'm looking at a car at the left of my eye, at the right of my eye, it's still a car. One way you can get that is by removing the dimension of where a car is located. So if you don't have where a car is located, you just have a car. Then you have invariance to the location of a car naturally. So dimensionality reduction, removing the dimensions that you want to be invariant to, is necessary for computing things with invariance to kind of tautological here. But deep neural networks that are optimized for object recognition They do this dimensionality reduction in later layers, and predictive V4 and cortical responses in some parts. So, dimensionality expansion, this is what we just saw. As a reminder though, the more you expand dimensionality, the more input separability we have, and that's just because we have this thing going on, and we have more flexibility in the output because we have more different ways we can color stuff and still be able to choose what we want to read. So we have many ways, we're very flexible. Working memory, this is exactly what I was saying earlier. In working memory, recurrent networks, they're mixing, they're non-linearly mixing, like the current state, new state, the non-linear mixing gives us high dimensionality, and then that's maybe an explanation for why you see high dimensionality in working memory. Not a very strong prediction because it's pretty well known that working memory is dimensionality, but something worth saying. This is what I've been saying several times. When you have random synaptic weights, and they have to be random. Like when you train them, they don't do this. If you train them on an artificial network, they don't do this. But they could, but they don't. Or in most practice, if you just introduce a layer of random synaptic weights, then it's a really efficient problem. In some way, the best way you can increase dimensionality of data, in some sense. Like that's the maximum you could do, is you could just randomly non-linearly project into a higher dimension.
But there's like no benefit to that, right?
So the benefit would be if you just ignored the input space and only focused on after the random projection, and then you try to do classification on that, then it would be useful. But you don't have like information exactly about the input space anymore, so it's kind of more confusing to think about. But it could be useful because you would just treat it as like the input is after the random projections.
But elasticity or other like high dimensionality like analyses, instead of like PC we're trying to reduce the dimensionality to look at it, you do like a high dimensionality projection and then try to cluster.
I see. But the projection into the higher dimension is just like completely random, right? It's just like noisy.
Well, it's not noisy because you're projecting into a higher dimension, so you're going through random weights, but you're still doing a nonlinear a combination of the actual inputs.
I see.
Yeah. So that's how you preserve some data.
So the theory of this paper is, for example, you have the artificial neural network, and it's from the input layer, and it's just the number of neurons in each layer is going down, and then after that it's going up for the recognition, like a cognition, something like that, right? So first it's going down, the number of neurons in each layer, and for the dimension reduction, and then later for the recognizing this image and just making the larger like that. Is this the theory of this paper?
And they don't go into a specific implementation. I think that's a good, that's one argument that could come out of this paper. I don't think that fits with data very well.
Okay.
But that's like kind of what they're arguing is it would be helpful if you were to do this compression and expansion, and then compression and expansion, or depending on what you wanted to do.
For example, if you design a neural network, should you make the dimension of each layer, the number of neurons in each layer, first going down and then going up?
The problem is, as my understanding is, when you're actually training these, it does work. Like you get less of a penalty for reducing the size of the later layers. Like it won't hurt you, but you're almost always better off for artificial neural networks just making bigger layers. So, for at least for the training process, there's some arguments for generalization, but it's not mentioned.
All it's assuming is the dimension of each layer should always be high. Always be high, consistently be high, always going down and then going up.
They're arguing that if you're looking at something and you see high dimensionality, then you're doing processing. But if you look at something and you see low dimensionality, then they're like already classified. That's what they're arguing. Yeah. All right. Just a conclusion slide here. Mixed because I have 30 seconds. Mixed selectivity neurons are selected for nonlinear combinations variables. The brain does this. It's signature for high dimensional data. We had this nifty counting technique for dimensionality. And that there are tricks you can use to balance expansion and reduction in neurons. Open for questions.
curious, how much this depends on you getting what you're trying to read out right? In the sense that you can imagine a world in which you think that there are 24 dimensions in a thing, but your network has somehow, it's not actually encoding all 24 of those in a way. And if I go in and then try and read out all 24, I necessarily am going to read out something higher than maybe what the underlying process is doing, if that makes any sense. And I'm curious then, if they're going in and making this claim, did they, train their task with 24 conditions or something, and if my brain area was only tracking 3 of those, or there was a subnetwork for different combinations of them, how much you get lost in this high-dimensional space, and how much of that is not just a byproduct of you just completely guessing wrong about what your brain area did.
That's a good point. So to reiterate, so if you have a low-dimensional structure and you're reading it out, forcing it to be high-dimensional, you'll see higher dimensions. Or you'll at least see mixed.
Yeah, I mean, if your task is a left, a right, and a left, and your rat has to go left, then right, and left, and the rat encodes that as one big trajectory, and you encode it as 6 terms.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah.
How susceptible are all of these methods to just user error in that sense?
Well, if you did the colorings, maybe the coloring technique you might see it if you were like really diligent and you looked at every combination to look for outliers. Because if you did all the colorings, no matter how many 3 combinations of 3, because the method calls for you to do all of them, and you don't see any outliers, then it's pretty unlikely that would be happening. But I think that it could happen. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable complaint. You would be protected if you used that metric and you were very diligent, I think, is what they would argue.
So when you design a neural network, so in each layer, the dimension should always be high, right? In each layer, all the layers. But in a few, maybe in the last presentation or sometimes there is like a decoder and then decoder. Remember there is a plot in somebody else's presentation. So what do you think? Is this decoder part is just intuitively or just the dimensions going down as in going up?
The autoencoders?
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
decoder, then decoder, something like that.
Yeah, so the idea there is it gets very, yeah, so if your goal is to get only the data you want, and you want it to be really separable, that's exactly what this does. So yeah, so that fits very well with this paper.
So the dimension, like the each layers, neural neurons first going down and then going up. How should we design a neural network? Should we give the dimension of each layer to be high, or should we make it lower and then higher?
So if you wanted to do the autoencoder, my understanding is if you want it to actually work, the best way is to train the autoencoder first, and then you train the output of the autoencoder to the network, which is high dimensional. The problem is if you train them together, it will just lose all your information on the first step. But if you train the autoencoder itself,
so
and then train
the cutoff length here. First we train this part, and then train the next part.
Train the autoencoder entirely, and then train another neural network that's just stacked fat layers on the right.
Is the same data or the
with the output from the autoencoder?
Output from here. Okay. But the dimension, what do you think the dimension here?
Yeah, it will go
going down.
Yeah, it'll have to go down. Yeah, and then it'll go up because of the random projections.
Okay. So if we design neural network, we should not let the dimension of each layer be consistently high, and then this is input, and then that's output. So this is not going to work.
It will, no, that'll give you the best possible for a deep propagation. You always want, I don't think you're ever hurt, in my experience, by having a wider layer. But if you change the input to being, the input part is now the output of the autoencoder, that can help you with generalization.
Oh, okay. So this way will help with the generalization. So first going down and then going up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you put that as the input. And my understanding is that is the easiest way to get autoencoders to help you without hurting you.
Do you know the reference for this theory? For the encoder, decoder, and the first between this part, then between the other part? Do you know the theory for that? I'm trying to design neural network to, and then I can make this dimension smaller and then going up.
Right, that's hard. I can, Stefano might have better papers. Okay, I'll free you all though from the set. So,
Where's the other people?
they're at the retreat.
Retreat? Is
Yeah.
Eric is going to be involved that? Is a trip, business trip, or what is it called?